Now, the British Museum is not only a beautiful building, it's not only got wonderful exhibits, it's the largest collection of historical artefacts in the world. So why are people always trying to decolonise it and send its treasures abroad? Are we losing our marbles? Well, to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. Mario Trabucco della Toretta, who's an archaeologist and historian and a writer of publications including The Critic. Welcome to The Sceptic, Mario.
Hello, welcome to everybody, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, good to have you here. Okay, so the British Museum is often at the centre of these quite toxic culture wars and pushes to decolonise our history and everything else. And, well, before we get into that, you're an archaeologist and a historian, and could you just explain to us, well, why is the British Museum so unique? And, tell us a bit about its history and how it came to be.
Absolutely. So, first of all, I would say, let's start with the big numbers. The British Museum is the first public national museum in the world. So it's, in a way, the prototype and the archetype for our particular perception of what one of these big national museums looks like. It was founded in 1753 with a big legacy by a man called Sir Hans Sloane. He had a big collection of 71,000 specimens of botanical specimens, pieces of antiquities, various collections, books, and everything. And he bequeathed this legacy to the nation for the edification of people. So it was to be a public collection. It was to be for an educational purpose. And this collection grew up exponentially across the ages, across these 2 centuries and a half, and now it's also the biggest collection in the world. More than 8 million items. And these 8 million items span a range, a temporal range, that basically goes from the beginning of the human activity, from Paleolithic and prehistorical items, all the way basically to the day before yesterday. So it's a monument in itself, in a way. So it's something that should be protected, and not only because of the value and the intrinsic importance of the elements it contains, but also as a monument of human ingenuity and ingeniousness and the breadth of collection that spans every country in the world and every period in history. Is something that is unprecedented and is basically unrivaled. Yes, okay, you have other big universal museums like the Louvre, the Metropolitan, the Smithsonian in certain cases, the museums in Berlin, but as one institution, one monolithic big collection with this vastness, there's no parallel. So that's definitely why we want to look at the British Museum the way we do. Also, there is one thing that I'm very keen on correcting whenever people just go and say, oh, there's nothing British about the British Museum. I would say everything is British about the British Museum, because the very idea of collecting everywhere in the world and go to the 4 corners of the planet to find whatever is important to document the history of man is something that is very British, actually. Is a testament to the legacy of the British and Scottish Enlightenment, and it's a monument to the courage sometimes, and there's people that have contributed to this museum by facing all sorts of adversities, and sometimes whenever you see the huge amounts that we see in the museum, people see it as a sort of Aladdin cave, as it has been sometimes called. But I see actually what has been endured by collectors, agents of the museum, and other characters that have made insurmountable efforts in order for us to gain these breadth and width of collection. So that's definitely British to me.
And of course, that does speak to this wonderful practice of philanthropists bequeathing things to the public at large. I mean, that's quite extraordinary, isn't it?
Absolutely. There was a much bigger sense of philanthropy and much big commitment to do this kind of big gestures that on one side would ensure that there is a legacy and that your name goes forward by leaving the Townley collection to the British Museum or the Elgin collection to the British Museum, etc. But on this sentiment of emergentism in a way still goes on. We have the Sainsbury wing in the British Museum, where, to make just one example, and there are many others. It's the idea of linking your name to something big, and so that your legacy may go on. But on the other side, it's also the idea of having the dwarves sitting on the shoulders of the giants. So you put a little bit, your little piece of a legacy, and it goes on the big mound, on the big heap of these huge monumental effort.
And so one of the controversies about this is how these objects were come by. And so, of course, you've described Hans Sloane's collection there as a collection of 71,000 objects. But people who might be tempted to criticize it might say that it was looted or that it was stolen. But, is that right?
No, obviously not. So if we look at the 8 million objects that are in the British Museum, there are only a handful, maybe no more than 10, that are really contested as looted, taken under murky circumstances, or whatever way people want to represent these. So whenever you hear the label of the biggest, the largest store of stolen goods to define the British Museum, this is a much criticizable oversimplification, because we are talking about 10 items against a wealth of 8 million. These 8 millions are basically being bought by the museum entirely legally, have been, as I said, the fruit of legacies and bequests that have been given to the museum, or there are things that have been just transferred to the British Museum from other bits and pieces that have been aggregated into the collection of the British Museum. Another very big source is, for example, the portable antiquity scheme. Whenever people go around with their metal detector up and down the country, and then all these little finds go into the British Museum, however important they may be, however small they may be. Sometimes it's a button, sometimes it's just a bit of a buckle. We are not talking about 8 million pieces of treasure in there. And these 8 million contain sometimes printed material, drawings, documents that are of some national importance, sherds of pottery that you wouldn't look twice at. I, for example, was in the British Museum more than 10 years ago when I was doing my PhD dissertation, and I was studying Attic weights. Those are the weights that you put on the scales whenever you go and buy a kilogram of bread or whatever. And I studied more than 400 exemplars in there. How many do you see of that same class in the cases of the museum? You see 3 of them. Why? Because all the others are basically identical to that, and they have importance for scholars, but they have very little importance whenever you are looking at them as a visitor. So whenever you are looking at all these wide variety of accession models, obviously, saying that everything was looted and everything was stolen is a massive nonsense. Obviously, yes, we have those 10, 12 items that are particularly contested. We are talking about the Benin bronzes, we are talking about the Elgin marbles, we are talking about the Rosetta Stone, the Oa Kananaya, the Moai drum. These are big ticket items that have excited the imagination of people up and down the country and all over the world, really. But Are they looted? No, definitely not. I can talk about Elgin Marbles forever, as you know, but this definition of looted Elgin Marbles comes from Byron, and Lord Byron knew near to nothing about the circumstances of the acquisition of the Elgin Marbles because he had not been there. He was there 10 years after the Elgin Marbles were taken, and he had a very big animosity towards Elgin. He was animated by anti-Scottish sentiments because of a little bit of inferiority complex of part of his ancestry. He was a Whig, and obviously he had it in for the Tory party and the landed gentry in general. He was massively influenced by French propaganda. He was a personal friend with the French consul in Athens, and he himself styled himself as the Napoleon of rhyme. So there's a big framework there where basically he constructed this narrative. It was used to invective against everyone and everything, and this unfortunately stuck onto Elgin and became part of the public discourse.
But I think the key point there being that they were taken legally and in fact at great personal cost and expense to Lord Elgin, and so given that. What are the arguments that are made for repatriating them? And, do they stack up?
So we have already discussed in a way about the looting matter. So there is no looting. First of all, looting is a very silly accusation because you know that looting in international law terms is basically only something that happens during wartime operations. So there was no state of war between Britain and the Ottoman Empire in 1801. Actually, they were the best of allies. So then this looting gets characterized as imperial looting. Britain, yes, obviously it had a dominant position in the international scene, but there was no point in history where Athens was a colony of the British Empire. So that's entirely silly again. They were not stolen, and that's one of the main accusations made by the Greeks themselves, the modern Greeks, that is. And there is the culture minister of Greece, Mrs. Dr. Lina Mendoni. She basically is dead against Elgin. She accuses Elgin of serial theft, which is obviously nonsense. We have seen why. Premier Mitsotakis is a little bit more nuanced. He said in a public interview to the BBC that they were essentially stolen. Now, things are either stolen or not stolen. Essentially stolen doesn't mean a thing. But then what we have is the argument, Greece didn't have no voice back then. Actually, Greece had a voice because the Greeks were ruled by the Ottomans, because obviously Athens was an integral part, a province of the Ottoman Empire, not a colony of the Ottoman Empire. And in the Ottoman millet system, basically the Greeks were administered for 90% of the aspects of public life by their own institutions, and in a way entrusted to the administrative care of the Orthodox hierarchy. And whenever they wanted to be heard by Constantinople, they were very able to do so. Just a few years before Elgin, a deputation of Greeks from Athens had managed to get rid of the Ottoman governor there, alias Eki, which was even beheaded because of the protest of the Greeks. What was the attitude of the Greeks towards antiquity? They were extremely attached to the antiquities, but because of superstition in a way. There are lots of British travelers that have reported stories of these people, basically these Ottoman Greeks that were attached they were attributing talismanic value to these statues. For example, there was a statue in Eleusis that they didn't want taken away from Edward Daniel Clark, because it was a guarantee of the fertility of the land, for example, and another inscription that they didn't want taken away by Elgin, for example, because it was supposed to have thaumaturgic powers. So there was no concept of cultural heritage back then. So that wasn't the attachment that they had. They were very favorable towards Elgin's money that was paying for all the operations in Athens, and the Orthodox hierarchy themselves, they were very friendly with both Elgin and his relatives, for example. You may have heard about the BL throne. This was a big marble seat. It was just willy-nilly taken away from the place where it was by the Ottoman Archbishop of Athens, and given as a present to Elgin's father-in-law. So there was a very cavalier attitude towards the antiquities from the Greeks themselves. And the Greeks, another argument was that this was supposed to be, the Parthenon was supposed to be core to the Greek identity. Back then, in 1801, there was no Greek identity as such. There was no idea of continuity between antiquity and the modern Greek. This is something that comes 20 years later, and there was no way Elgin could know this beforehand. Still in 1796, for example, Yorgos Sakellarios, which was one of the leading figures of the Greek Enlightenment, he just says, our people don't even know where they come from. It's something that actually is a phenomenon. The knowledge of their own roots, in a way, is something that comes from abroad, because all these Greeks are scattered towards across the course of Europe, and they learn about the antiquarian studies that in the West are performed routinely from generation now, and they bring all this knowledge back to Greece during the decades after Elgin. The other silly argument that I find is, okay, now they've built a museum for them, so they should have them back. So this is an entirely unsustainable argument, because if the people of Florence build the Mona Lisa museum, then they get it back from Paris. That's not the way cultural heritage gets allocated. Cultural property is property, therefore it must be subject to good title and ownership laws and the rule of law overall. So that's this idea that whereby, okay, they've built a museum for it, therefore they're going to get them back. Entirely stupid. And then there is the other thing, what for? Why should they get them back? They have this idea whereby the national revolution that brought about the modern Greek state won't be completed in a way until the Parthenon marbles are back, because the Parthenon is the symbol of this Greek unity. Therefore, getting these members scattered all over Europe is important for them to get this monument back, their symbol back. But all of these comes 20, 30 years after Elgin. There was no such thing. And also, this idea of the cultural continuity, with our cultural unbroken continuity between Themistocles and Pericles and Mr. Mitsotakis, is entirely for the birds. So, as you see, there are many reasons why we should resist these. In terms of the motivation of the Greek claim, which is unacceptable. But also from our point of view, why should we get rid of something that is so key to the definition of English cultural and Western cultural history? The British Museum ownership of the Elgin Marbles has been the trigger of a re-evaluation of antiquity. For example, it's the first major lot of ancient statuary that doesn't get restored when before it was customary to just remake hands and limbs and heads and reattach them to make them pretty in a way, in the neoclassical way. There is an about turn specifically for the Elgin marbles when people like Flaxman, like Canova, look at these marbles and say, no, wait, we cannot touch what Fidi has done. It's broken, fine, but leave it as it is, because it would be the start of an endless controversy if we were to make our own modern interventions on this. And this is a change. Then there is obviously the big inspiration that these marbles have provided to artists in all the Regency period and even in Victorian times. Not only British artists, even artists from abroad. There's Picasso that has a nice figure that is coming straight from the Dionysos. There is Rodin. The British Museum some years back made a fantastic exhibition of Rodin in connection with the inspiration he got from the Elgin marbles, and so many others. Even the chess pieces that we use every day, the figure of the horse, of the knight, is actually the horse of Cellini from the Elgin marbles. So all of these is our story, our cultural story. We shouldn't be giving up pieces of our cultural story just because, first of all, we don't care about our cultural story, history anymore, and to help out somebody else that doesn't have title to them just to make a botched narrative come true.
And I suppose finally, I mean, the arguments, as you say, don't really stack up, but nevertheless, the zeal to, as they would call it, decolonise our museums and everything else continues. And I suppose, well, where do you think that impulse comes from? And, well, what can we do to fight back against it?
So, in terms of the decolonization narrative, we are in a situation where the barbarians are at the gate. We see the vultures circling above the body of the almost dead Western civilization. And obviously, everybody is just saying, oh, okay, it's for the picking. I want this, I want that, I want money for idealistic and invented historical tours made by the Western powers that were. And in this narrative, obviously, in order to substantiate these claims, what you see is the emergence of tweaked histories in a way, where obviously there is misrepresentation, selection bias of the facts. For example, Dan Hicks was under fire very recently because of the totally unscientific way he wrote his account of the British Museum, and just picking and choosing, deciding what you want to talk about, and brushing under the carpet all the other relevant historical details. And from narratives like these, what emerges is a landscape where our schools and our academia are being instrumental to an anti-Western feeling. It's astounding because basically in during the fall of the Roman Empire, for example, the aggression was coming from outside. During this second fall of the Western Empire, the aggression is coming from within, because we are getting people that from our own institutions are undermining all the shared narrative that makes the self-representation of Western culture. And decolonization is only one branch of it. Then there is woke, then there is the anti-Christian sentiment, then there is the oikophobia that has been described so well by Benedict Beckold. There's plenty. There's what Douglas Murray was saying about war against the West, Furedi, war against the past. The past is one of the elements of this undermining of our own image of self. What can we do? That's a very great question. My take, obviously, as an historian, is be very vigilant on the kind of histories that get narrated in our academia, in our books, into our cultural institutions, and start pushing back. Obviously, yes, there is the spectrum of the big ghost of cancel culture that is obviously fundamentally undermining and threatening anybody that speaks loudly about these things. And for example, the case of Nigel Bigger was paradigmatic, but also Kathleen Stock and many others, and that just. If they dare to speak against these narratives, they get labeled as racist, as defenders of imperialism, as bigots and ultra-traditionalists, etc. We need to dare challenge this orthodoxy. We need to just have people of goodwill that basically take the basic teaching from Edmund Burke and say, for evil to triumph, all it takes is for the good people to do nothing. And that's exactly the point. Good people need to try harder, and need to try and say, sorry, this cannot go on. This is not true. We are not racist. We are not the most racist country in the world. We actually are the first people that actually started pushing back against slavery. We are people that, yes, obviously, we're responsible for the biggest empire on earth. But look at the influence of this biggest empire. Obviously, yes, there were elements that went pear-shaped. But on the other side, a quarter of the world has a position of advantage because of the legacy of the British Empire, because of the institutions that have been set up by the British Empire in those places. So that's what we can do, is police our history and just stop taking acritically what is basically given to us by the mainstream media. And obviously the work that you are doing in this very moment is part of that effort.
Well, it's good to have you come on and set the record straight for us. Dr. Mario Trabucco, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Lovely to be here. Thank you.
And that's it for this episode of The Sceptic. Thanks for watching, and see you again next week.